Hi, welcome to another edition of Hub City Times Presents Author's Corner. I'm here today with Marshfield native John Armbruster.
Very good.
Hi, John.
Hi.
We were working on that name for a little while.
Yes, you got it.
And so, John, you wrote a book,
Yes,
correct?
I did.
And what is the name of that book?
Name of the book is Tailspin.
And can you tell me a little bit about it?
You bet. Let's see. Well, it starts in southwestern Wisconsin. I moved there 30 years ago where I'm a teacher. And while I was my rookie year, first semester, I was at an in-service at my school, and I was shy. I didn't know anybody. I was new to the area. I mean, I had lived in Marshfield for most of my life up until then. And there were a couple teachers talking in front of me. They were visiting teachers from another school district, and they said, you know, this is the school. This is the school where that daughter lives of the guy that fell 4 miles from the sky. And this was at a break during the in-service, people drinking coffee, eating donuts, and I'm like, what was that? You know? And I'm like, I didn't hear that right. And they're like, oh yeah, this guy was this tail gunner in World War II, got shot down, fell 4 miles and lived. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. And they said his daughter is Joni Peterson, a teacher here. I'm like, well, Joni's classroom is right next to mine. So at the end of the day, I burst into the room and I'm like, oh my God, is this true? Is this your dad? They didn't have this right, did they? And she's like, oh, they did. And so I'm a new history teacher and I'm all excited. I'm like, oh my God, World War II veteran, amazing story. I mean, it's the 8th Air Force from England, the biggest air war of all time, tail gunner, flying fortress plane. It's all Hollywood stuff. I'm like, this is going to be great. And the daughter said, you will not do that. We don't go there. And I felt kind of badly asking her. Ironically, her husband had just died, and he was a Vietnam combat vet, and he had died of a heart attack. And so she knew a lot of veterans don't like to talk about their stories. And she said, no, we just don't talk about it. And over the years, I got to know the family. Both my late wife, Carmen, who's also from Marshfield, both of our fathers died early, so my sons didn't have grandfathers. And so Gene Moran, the subject of my book, kind of became a surrogate grandfather for my kids. And we just got to know the family really well. And he would come to my boys' first communions and birthday parties and all that stuff. And I always knew this story. And we would talk hunting, we'd talk Packers football, Brewers baseball, fishing, but you never talked about the war story. And of course, as a history teacher, and I was always a World War II buff, I'm dying to know the story.
Yeah.
You didn't go there. And so years passed, and in 2007, Congressman Ron Kine did a veterans project and invited Gene to the La Crosse airport. And Gene agreed to go. And so the family was all excited. Oh my God, Dad's finally going to talk. And we were invited to the interview. And Congressman kind of felt kind of badly for him. The interview only went 20 minutes. Gene was very short, cryptic in his answers, and then stopped it suddenly. And the congressman didn't get very far. But they gave Gene a ride in a Flying Fortress airplane that day that was brought over from Oshkosh EAA show. And he was on the front page of the La Crosse Tribune and the TV stations, and he just said, all right, I did that once and I'm never doing it again. And it wasn't just the plane ride. I thought he was talking about the story, but a few years went by, and myself and some of Gene's Legion friends and family members are trying to urge him, saying, you have this amazing story of air combat in World War II, getting shot down, falling 4 miles without a parachute into the woods and living. You've got to tell somebody. You can't take the story to the grave. And the family approached me and said, well, why don't you write it? You're the one always talking about it. I'm like, no. I'm like, no way. That's crazy. I do have a journalism degree. I was first a journalist.
Okay.
I actually wrote for the Marshfield News Herald for a little while. 30 years ago, I did sports for a while. And I worked at the La Crosse Tribune. And I wrote for public radio for a little while, too. But it had been, at that point, it had been 20-some years since. And I wrote, basketball roundups, highlights of Pittsfield versus Marathon, and I'm not qualified to do this. I'm like, no. And so I dropped the idea for a bit. But then the family came back to me and said, well, Dad's not going to do it unless you do it, because he knows you, he trusts you.
Okay.
So I'm like, what the heck? Let's write a book. I had no idea what I was getting into because it took 11 years.
Oh, wow.
And not just the writing of it, but getting an agent, finding a publisher, because there's so much rejection out there. There are a lot of wannabe authors, not so many publishers. But finally, it happened just a month ago, April 30th, the book was finally published.
Well, that's
Here it is.
awesome. And there it is.
Yes.
And so you said it took you 11 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so the name of the main character or
Yes.
the person that this is based on, what is his name?
Gene Moran, he grew up on a dairy farm in southwestern Wisconsin during the Great Depression. And one of the things when people read the book is, I've had a lot of comments like, it's like, this guy had more lives than a cat. It's just every time, it's like, he lives, but every time you're reading the book, it's like, oh, this is it, he's going to die, he's going to die.
Yeah.
He just survives over and over. And I think the apprenticeship that he had to survive what he did may have been dairy farming in southwestern Wisconsin during the Depression. I mean, I grew up working on dairy farms in central Wisconsin here. But when we baled hay, it was on flat ground. Ridge and Valley country in southwest Wisconsin, that's the driftless area. He had to farm in hills and ridges and valleys. It's a lot of work chasing cows and bringing them back in and baling hay, not wanting wagons to tip and spreading manure. And then this is during the Great Depression.
Right.
They didn't have a dime to their name. They didn't have electricity until 1940. So it was a very challenging and difficult life. And that's why he went to war. I know a lot of times especially during Memorial Day, which we just finished up, people talk about patriotism and, doing things for your country. Gene joined the military to get off the farm. He couldn't stand dairy farming anymore. In fact, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was 17 at the time. And he was working at his uncle's farm, and he came in, and they shushed him, and quiet, it's on the radio. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And he said he was elated. He was excited. This is awesome. And when he's telling me this, I'm interviewing him. And I interviewed Gene over the course of 3 years to put this book together. And Gene died in 2014, so I still had a lot of work to do.
Oh, and so he doesn't even know the book was...
No, he didn't.
Oh.
No, there's a long story there, too. And how long is this program? I could talk all day. But no, Gene counted, he was 17, he counted the months until his 18th birthday to join the military. He said, I so wanted off the farm. I wanted something different. But when he joined his 18th birthday, he hitchhikes to Madison. He wants to join the Army Air Corps, which wasn't the Air Force yet. The Air Force was created after World War II. The Air Force was still part of the Army then. And he wanted to fly. But the Army Air Corps had a policy, you had to be 21 to join on your own. You could at 18, but with parent permission, because the Army Air Corps was all volunteer. Well, he tried forging his parents' signature. The recruiter caught him. Then he got his cousin, a young woman, to forge a signature because she had better handwriting. Got caught again. So he's got plan C, and he goes home, and he tells his parents, I signed up, I forged your signature, and I have already taken the oath of office. I've sworn to the Constitution to uphold and defend. And he completely lied and said, you just got to sign these papers just so that, all my facts come back here and that, everything's all official. I'm already in. He said, and he's lying the entire time.
Yes.
Because his mother did not want him to go to war. She wanted him to get a farming exemption, which young men could do then, because you got to produce milk as well as bullets to win World War II. And she said, you can get a farming exemption. You can stay right home. And I said, no, already joined. You have to sign just some paperwork here. It's just this formalities. She didn't know that she was signing him to give permission to join the Army Air Corps. So he lied to get in. But he really enjoyed military life. He signed up to be a gunner on a plane. He thought his grades weren't so hot in high school for him to be a pilot. Usually I had to have a little bit of college or good grades in high school to do that. So he signed up to be a gunner. And he loved Army life because he was used to getting up early as a dairy farmer.
Right.
He was used to working hard. Dairy farmers, so the exercising didn't bother him. And things like even handling a 50 caliber machine gun, which are very heavy machine guns, he could handle because his forearms were so steeled. And he loved it. It's like you get to fly and you got best friends and you get some leave time to party, which he liked to do. And so World War II was great until he went to England. He was assigned to England with 8th Air Force and in November of 1943. And this is when the American bombers were trying to bomb Germany into submission, basically, by destroying their industry. And in 1943, it wasn't going very well. The Americans did not have fighter planes that could go all the way to Germany with them and protect them. So the 8th Air Force was losing a lot of planes. Only 1 in 3 guys were finishing their tour of duties. It was a deadly occupation. So Gene gets there, and he was flying just about every day that November of 1943. And on his 5th mission, he was shot down. They attacked Bremen, which was a very large city, an industrial city. Kind of think of Milwaukee, a very industrial city. When they got the assignment to go to Bremen, he thought, oh dear, this is going to be a bad day. And he actually said before he got into the plane, he went behind the plane, stuck behind the back, and threw up. He was very nervous about that day. And sure enough, they flew through the gauntlet of German fighters and flaked the anti-aircraft bombs in the air. They made it, but on their way home, they got attacked by more German fighters. And for some reason, his plane fell back from all the others, for reasons he never figured out. And think about like National Geographic films or nature films we watch where the one zebra gets separated from the herd and all the lions descend. That's what happened to Gene's plane. And soon everyone on the plane was firing. Now these guys were, they had trained together, they had partied together, they'd gone to church together, they were like brothers. So this horrific fight that ensues, Gene can hear his buds dying one by one.
Oh my God.
Because they're on an intercom, they're screaming, they're yelling for one another. And Gene, but somehow the pilot managed to keep the plane level, but it's just getting shredded, the plane. And then a German fighter plane pulled up right next to Gene. So you have the main bomber here, and then the fighter swooped in over here out of the range of Gene's guns. And got from me to the door away. And Gene, so you have the enemy facing the American. And Gene's like, what is going on? And the German pilot pointed down. And Gene's like, is he taunting me? Is he? And then he's like, no. And he's yelling at him. And Gene figured it out. He's telling me to get out. Get out of the plane, bail out. Then someone was alive, cut loose from the front, fired from the front, and that plane took off. Well, that was his chance to escape because there were other German planes waiting that came in to finish off the kill. And then at that point, Gene gets shot. He's shot in both arms. An explosion in the tail section of the plane slammed him into his guns. So heavy metal guns broke all his ribs on his left side. And then a bullet went through his parachute in the back. And there was just shreds everywhere, just silk shreds everywhere. So it's just a bizarre scene of noise and screaming and firing. The plane's starting to go down at this point, and it's starting to whine. So he does have a spare parachute. So he's crawling forward. His forearms are busted because they've been shot.
Yeah.
And he's crawling forward trying to get to that spare parachute, but he can't because the G-forces are pinning him because the plane's going down at this point. And he could see his 2 buddies in front of him. They're 2 waist gunners. They were dead, lying on the floor.
Oh my God.
So it's 2 best friends laying right there. And but he can see the parachute, and just before he gets to the parachute, the plane rips right in front of him. I mean, he said he slammed his elbows into the fuselage, and he said, I'm looking right on his face. And he could see the main part of the plane go forward, and he just whipped his body around, and then he pulled out a rosary from his grandmother and just started praying. He just said, I just started relaxing. He said, I'm dead. There's nothing I can do. I'm just going to die. Why fight it? That was what he told me. And he hit the ground, and I've been to the spot where he fell. The Germans of that city, and the city where his plane was destroyed is called Zika, Germany, the same size as Marshfield.
Okay.
In fact, I've been there. The geography is the same as Marshfield. It was so strange. It's like marshy, it's flat, little plots of woods. So when I went there, and I'm thinking, I got my geography wrong here a little bit. I'm thinking an alpine forest or meadow, big pine trees, something that would have cushioned his blow, would have explained why he survived. And it's just a crappy little woods like you'd see around here. There just wasn't much to it. The Germans know the story better than we do, and that's why they invited the family and myself over to celebrate the 75th anniversary. And they've got historical markers where it happened, because then the plane itself blew up over the city and started fires all over the city. So, I mean, imagine a large plane blowing up over Marshfield and setting fires. Everyone would have stories from that day. So I interviewed many of the people that were kids then, and there were 10 guys in the plane. Miraculously, 2 survived. One had actually survived the explosion and could have written a book about him too. But yeah, Gene hits the ground into the woods, and then he thinks he's dead. And the plane kind of swung, hit the trees, and swung him to the bottom, and he crawled out. And he crawled toward the light, thinking,
It's
crawl
the
to
light, yeah.
Yes. And he said, and at this point he's blind. The tail section fell so fast that the G-forces pushed blood up into his eyes.
Okay.
So he can't, there's blood in his eyes, he can't see. And he fell so fast that the teeth fillings of his mouth popped out.
Oh my gosh.
His dental fillings popped out. But he crawls out, and I'm thinking about the interviews that we have, and of course I'm just like, riveted. I'm
Like I am right now.
yeah, it's like, this can't be true.
Yeah.
And he said, I crawled out and started feeling some grass and dirt and leaves. And then he said, I started laughing. I'm like, what? He's like, I was so tickled I cheated death. But he knew he was wounded. And then he didn't feel any pain. All of a sudden, he could feel a strange sensation from his head. And he put his hand up by his head, and his skull was cracked. In the crash, his skull, and his brain was exposed. It was
gosh.
It was a 7-inch fissure. Now, 3 years of interviewing him, now I knew Gene before, and he always wore a cap. He was self-conscious about that scar.
Yeah.
Our first interview, he took off his hat for the first time, and I'm like, oh, whoa. I had never seen the scar. It's like a 7-inch scar. And his skull, he felt his brain, and he's like, I'm not going anywhere. And so he just laid there. And he was captured by, ironically, French prisoners of war. There was a POW camp nearby. The Germans let the French out to scavenge for food. And because at this point, France is under Nazi occupation, they don't worry about them escaping because there's nowhere they can go. Their country's conquered. So they would let the French out, scrounge for nuts and berries in the woods. Of course, it's November, but they would also, the French learned to find plane crashes. They would watch air raids and then find where the planes crashed because they knew the American servicemen carried Hershey bars
Okay.
for rations. And so 4 or 5 Frenchmen found him, and they ripped off his Hershey bars, and then they ripped out his throat mic too because they would steal that stuff and make homemade radios out of it that they weren't supposed to have. And then all of a sudden Gene said, he looked at him and said, doctor, because now his head's starting to throb, he's starting to feel pain. And the Frenchmen are like they saw a ghost. And then they went and got German soldiers who threw him on an ox cart. And he was about 20 meters from a field. And they threw him on an ox cart. But then they paraded him through town, and he almost died there. A lot of times, German civilians and even farmers would kill American flyers outright. They would just shoot them, even stab them with pitchforks because they hated them. Because a lot of times the American bombs missed and destroyed their homes.
Right.
There were a lot of civilian casualties. So they saw they called them gangsters, murderers. So this small town like where I grew up, Chile, Wisconsin, he was going through a small town, and the people attacked the cart he was on. They were spitting at him, throwing rocks at him, and it was ironically the German soldiers that saved him. They shouted, yelled, get away from him, he's ours. And then he would end up at a POW camp where 2 doctors from Serbia took a look at the mess that he was and said, we're going to try putting him back together. And he found this story out later because he's coming in and out of consciousness. And they saved him. And but they would spend the next 18 months in various POW camps in Germany. And it was quite a brutal ordeal, which no one knew anything about until I started interviewing him and doing research for this story.
Wow.
I could go on forever. Yes, and the POW is experience. You could have written a book just on his POW experience. It was it varied, the different POW camps. Some of the officers may be treated better than maybe the enlisted men. Gene was a sergeant. The Germans were very hierarchical. They put all the sergeants in one camp and the officers in the other, and the sergeants tended to get treated not very well, because they were considered lower class. And but he happened to end up in a couple camps which were just run by some terrible people. And then at the end of the war they had the camps on the eastern side of the war where the Russians were coming. And as the Russians were coming, the Germans moved them a lot. They were trying to hold on to these prisoners for God knows why. Some thought that maybe Hitler was going to use them as bargaining chips for some negotiated settlement at the end of the war. Long story short, when the Russians were coming, he had to endure a 600-mile death march in the winter, sleeping outside, living off the land with other prisoners, It may remind people of the Bataan Death March that's in a lot of history books in 1942 in the Pacific Theater in the Philippines. The Germans didn't shoot and kill Americans outright as had happened at that march, but a lot of the POWs died from neglect and starvation, dysentery. They were filthy, they were disease-ridden. 600 miles they had to march. They were always sleeping outside. Maybe they'd be lucky to sleep in a barn one night until he was finally liberated at the end of April of 1945. And most of the prisoners were about 90 pounds when they liberated them. Gene was actually about 120 because he just had a knack for finding food, being a farm boy.
Right.
And those farm skills really helped him survive. He knew where to find food on a farm, where rutabagas and potatoes would be buried, and maybe an animal here or there. Where even to find grain, just to go find grain and just stuff your mouth full of grain if they could. But another part of the story, too, which was a very difficult part to write, was, what happened with Gene after the war, particularly his struggles with PTSD, which they didn't even have that term in 1940s and 50s. It was called shell shock, and you covered it up with alcohol, and who cared? You went on with your life. And I think a lot of times, too, that, we think about, we've come to know these issues with Vietnam. When those veterans came home, they were often ignored and not treated very well, and we started, identifying terms like PTSD, what those guys suffered, why they are dealing with issues after the war. Iraq and Afghanistan, too, especially with head wounds with improvised explosive devices. But I think sometimes there's a stereotype of World War II, well, these guys were heroes. This was the good war. They won, they came home, they're heroes, they started their lives, and things were ignored. Gene publicly may have been a war hero, and people knew his story, although he didn't talk about it. But
right.
he was in several newspapers when he came home because the story got back to America. But he didn't talk about it. But privately, things were tough at home. Yeah, and in fact, when he went through the Army, when he came home, he had some evaluation, and an Army psychiatrist said, because of your wounds and your horrible experiences, he said, I advise you not to get married or have kids. He said, you will be dead in 10 years. I mean, how cruel and rough that is to say to a veteran. And he's 21 when he's told this, okay? He's 21-year-old
Wow.
kid. And he said, no, he goes, I hate to say it, you'll die from insanity or suicide, or you're not going to be a good husband or father. And he said, don't do it. Well, Gene was a rebel. He married 3 months later and had 9 kids.
Well, he proved him wrong.
He did. And because I knew one of the kids is why I became the author of this book.
That's pretty cool. And so the book is based on from the time that he enlists?
Yeah, it's actually the opening chapter is when he got shot down. And then I go back into the story. And my editor and I did some different things about this. She said, this old man seems like quite a character, quite a rascal. Is there a way that we can, incorporate these interviews which you had with him over a 3-year period? And I said, sure. I said, I think I can do that. And kind of like the book Tuesdays with Maury, a writer interviewing an old man near the end of his life. I said, we can do that. And then, which just makes this, now in the last 20, 25 years, a lot of World War II veterans have written their stories, but that greatest generation, as they're called, they're dying, they're passing on. They're in their late 90s and over 100 now. So there's been a lot of books out, and my editor said, I really want to make this unique. And I agreed with her, but then she pulled something, I shouldn't say pulled something, but had a wild card for me. She said, no, wait a minute. During this time, your wife was dying of cancer, which she was. And my wife and the character of the book were very good friends. He just had a big crush on her. So,
cute.
So she was fighting cancer. And so when I took on this project, her cancer was in remission, which, all right, let's give this a try. Maybe we beat it, but we didn't. And halfway through, and my wife Carmen Zimmerman was her name. She's from Marshfield. She died when Gene and I were about halfway through our interviews. So my editor was like, wait a minute. While you're doing these interviews and trying to get this story out, your wife died? I'm like, yeah. She said, well, as a reader, I have to know that. If you're going to put yourself as a character with Gene at his table, interviewing him, we got to know that the author's got stuff going on. I'm like, no, you don't. I said, I lived it. I'm not going to write about it. It's too personal. Long story short, we did.
I was just going to call you out being Gene, because Gene didn't want to tell his story either.
That's the irony of it. It's like,
it really is.
Like, I don't want to do this. I'm not going to do this. And even when I finally did decide to write about it, my editor, and she was a taskmaster, she'd say, okay, do this over. This is bad. This is boring. Rewrite. I have rewrote these chapters over and over, but she said, especially with the Carmen story, she said, I'm just not feeling it. She said, I'm not getting any passion here. You're avoiding it. And then I actually got angry. And this was about 5 summers ago. I said, all right, you want to know what it's like? Here's what it's like. And I just wrote every detail and moment of anguish and suffering and how she suffered and I sent it to her. And she sent it back and she said, you had me crying 3 times in these 2 chapters. And she said, you're finally becoming a writer, which I never intended to do because this was all accidental how this happened. So I think Tailspin's a very unique war story, and it becomes a number of stories blended into one. And I told my editor, I said, either this is going to be a big success or a complete failure, because some people may be picking up and say, hey, I wanted a war story, not a cancer story. Others may say, I wanted a cancer story, not a war story. Well, somehow I think we got them together, and I think it's working. The reviews have been outstanding.
Well, and it is interesting how neither one of you wanted to tell your story. They're stories that others can relate to.
Yes.
And unfortunately, but it's giving them maybe that feeling of not being alone.
Right. Oh, I get that all the time at book signings. You know, people will come up to me. I can't tell you how many book signings, not to sound whiny, but can be exhausting emotionally, because I'll get people come up and they'll just be crying like, oh my God, my dad was a World War II vet and there were PTSD issues we didn't talk about. I've had even spouses of, I had a Vietnam war widow talk to me and just was crying. But I've had some people too who've gone through cancer that lost a parent to cancer, and they're like, oh my God, I could so relate to your situation, or your 2 boys dealing with their mother dying. And so these are very emotional book signings.
I guess.
People just want to, they've got a story to tell too. They can relate and they spill their guts. And I listen, and I'm like, thank you. I'm glad you were able to relate.
And I'm glad you were able to tell your story and actually his story also, that, I mean, he wasn't comfortable saying.
Yeah, it's like you said, it really is a remarkable story of accidents happening, accidents of me being there, becoming friends, I had no intention of becoming a writer. With this book, I had no intention of telling my story. Things evolved, and here we are today.
That's pretty neat. I mean,
I know it's a little overwhelming.
It is, and I mean, I got to be honest. I'm not like a war person. Sorry, history teacher.
No, that's all right. I get this all the time. They're like, I'm not really into history books, but this is really good.
And I am like, okay, so tell me, how do I get my hands on this book?
You can, it's on Amazon, it's on Barnes & Noble. I like to direct people to my publisher, 1016 Press, out of Waukesha, Wisconsin, because they get a bigger cut. Jeff Bezos has enough money, so Amazon, you don't have to get it at Amazon.
Don't tell Amazon we said that.
Right, but you can get it directly from my publisher at 1016 Press. They have a website you can order directly from. I also have my website, johnmarmbruster.com. You can order it off there. It is being sold at the newly opened War Museum here in Marshfield on Main Street. And I have an appearance at the Marshfield Library Wednesday, July 20th, I believe that is. And then I will also be at Hub City Days at the War Museum signing books.
And we're working on getting you in at Hub City Times, too.
Absolutely. Hey, wherever you
That's in the works right now.
Wherever you want to sell it, I'll be glad to.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to
No,
it?
thank you very much. It's great to be back in my hometown and talking about this book. I think for Marshfield people, they will recognize Carmen in the story, Carmen Zimmerman. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting a Zimmerman in Marshfield. There's so many. So a lot of Zimmermans in Marshfield.
Yes,
so I think they'll be able to relate to the story too. So I think a lot of Marshfield people will enjoy it.
Well, thank you, and thank you for joining us today.
You bet, Peggy Sue. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for joining us for another edition of Hub City Times Presents Author's Corner.